Hi guys, I'm Isabel Price, and in this video I'll be showing you how to make the base of a fidget sleeve. I wanted to make this video and share it to spread awareness about a project that I'm doing called Crocheting for a Cause. In this project, I make and collect fidget sleeves from wonderful people all around my state and surrounding states, and then I distribute these sleeves to facilities like nursing homes and just directly to individuals who are affected by Alzheimer's. These sleeves really bring comfort to these people, and I'm very passionate about this project, so I'm super excited to be sharing it with you. If you have any questions about a specific part of the video, please let me know. I would be happy to send you a close-up video, a slow motion video, just more instructions, really anything. Just let me know and I'll get right back in touch with you. So with all that being said, I'm super excited that you're here, and I hope that you enjoyed the video. Thank you. Hey y'all, I'm going to start by showing y'all the hook that I use and the yarn that I'll be using for my fidget sleeve in this video. We're going to start our sleeve by making a slip knot. I like to tighten the knot around my hook, but I leave just enough space where you could almost fit another hook inside of the loop. And now we're ready to start our first chain. Loop the yarn around the back of the hook and pull that single loop through the first one you made. Loop it around the back again and pull it through. Keep this process going until you reach the end of your first chain. Your chain should start to look almost like a braid. When your chain is as long as your forearm, that means you're done. Now that you've finished the first chain, it's time to start adding rows. I'm holding my hook in my right hand and it's still in the loop that I finished in. I'm going to point out the top and the bottom loop of this chain, and we're going to be working with the top loop. To start the next row, you're going to want to skip the loop that's closest to your hook and go into the second closest one. You bring your hook around to the front and push it through to the back of your chain. Now you're going to want to take your yarn, loop it into your hook, and pull this yarn through only the chain. Now there should be 2 loops on your hook. Now you take your yarn and loop it over the back of your hook. Flip your hook upside down so it will pull through easier, and pull it through the 2 loops that were just on your hook. Now you only have 1 loop on your hook, and you can see where the corner has started to form. After we created the initial chain, we're now into the main part of making the sleeve. I like to think of rows as a 3-step process, and I'll talk you through them. The first step is finding which hole to go through. Remember, we're working with the top part of the chain, so you want to go into the hole directly next to the one that you just worked on. The second step is pushing your hook through that hole and looping the yarn over the front of your hook. Then you pull the yarn right back through. Now you have 2 loops on your hook. So the third step is looping the yarn behind your hook, twisting it so it pulls through easier, and pulling this yarn onto your hook so you only have 1 loop on now. You repeat those 3 steps all the way to the end of your chain. As I'm making this sleeve, the whole time I'm making sure not to pull the yarn too tight. If I pull it too tight, then it will be hard later to make rows because my hook won't come through as easy. So as you're making your sleeve, make sure not to pull your yarn too tight. Here I've reached the end of my row, and this step that I'm doing is very important. Loop your yarn over your hook one more time and make another loop just like we did with the chain in the very beginning. You do this every time you finish a new row. So now you have your first row attached to your chain, and I forgot to record it, but now's a good time for you to tie off the bottom left where you started your original chain. To continue the sleeve, you flip the whole thing over and continue those 3 steps. Here I want to point out which hole you go through next. You don't go through the one closest to your hook, but you go through the second closest one. Now I want to point out that unlike earlier, we're going to have 3 loops on our hook in the first step. Earlier we only had 2, and that's only because we are attaching to the original chain. But now, since we made a row before this one, we're attaching to another row. So this is what it will look like for the rest of the time we're making this sleeve. Here I'm just following those 3 steps over and over again until I reach the other end of this row. As I mentioned before, while I'm making all of these rows and pulling through all of these loops, I'm making sure not to pull any of them too tight. When I reach the end of the row, I double check to see if there's any at the very end that I need to loop through. So what I'm pulling apart right there is one that I need to go through to finish this row. Here I have 3 loops on, like I mentioned before, and then I just complete the rest of the steps. Since this was the end of the row, I have to do that one extra loop that I mentioned before to completely finish it. And then I'll just flip it over and start the next row. So right now, this is the part where I actually make a mistake in my sleeve. Instead of going through the second closest hole, I just went through the closest one. Making this mistake really isn't the end of the world. It just means that whenever I finish my sleeve, it will look more like a trapezoid than a rectangle, which it's supposed to look like. Later in this video, I'll show you the easy way that I fixed these mistakes that I made. Now I'm just making row after row after row, making sure not to pull anything too tight. Now I've reached the halfway point for my sleeve. I decided that I wanted to change colors, so I stopped right in the middle of a row. Now I'm going to cut away from the yarn that I have been using, and I cut a finger's length just to make sure I have enough to attach to the next color. The next yarn that I'll be using is the same brand and type of yarn that I started with. Here you can already start to see how my sleeve is looking a little bit like a trapezoid. And if yours is looking like this too, then don't worry, I'll show y'all the easy way I fix this later. I just use a really easy knot to connect these two colors, and any type of knot that you use will work as long as they're securely attached to each other. Whenever I change colors, I always leave the little ends of the strings still attached, because it's just another thing that a patient could play with. I never cut these off, even though sometimes it may make my sleeves look a little messy. After I switched colors, I just continued making rows like I did before. So now I think I'm about done with my sleeve, and to test this, I'll just wrap it around my arm and see if it will close easily in the middle. You can always make it larger if you want. Now it's time to fix my mistakes from earlier. My idea was to fold in the top part of the sleeve that stick out way too far, so that whenever it's time to attach both sides of my fidget sleeve together, the lengths will be about equal. So the way that I fix my sleeve is in no way a special crochet technique or skill. I didn't look this up anywhere. I'm still a beginner, obviously. I don't think a more advanced person would even have to come to this problem, but I just really wanted to include this part of the video just to show you that making sleeves really can be your own personal thing. You can customize them, run into problems, figure out easy, fun ways to fix them. And I just wanted to show you that nothing has to be perfect. So basically what I ended up doing is making a ladder of sorts so that whenever I pulled it tight, the outside would fold over into the inside. After I tightened it by pulling the top and the bottom strings, I saw that it gave me the more rectangle shape that I was going for. I tied off the top and the bottom and used about 2 or 3 knots on each just to make sure it wouldn't come apart. After I fixed this side of the sleeve, I saw that it gave me the better edge that I was hoping for. I also folded up the sleeve to make sure that it would line up whenever it was time to sew both sides together. Before I did the same thing to the other side, I needed to close off my sleeve, so all I did was cut the yarn, pass it through the very last loop I had made, and tied it off. So now I just did the exact same thing to the left side that I had done to the right side. And then to finish it off, I tied off the top and the bottom of the strings. My idea had worked out pretty well, and the sides of the sleeve were much closer in length than they were before. So now it was time to tie my sleeve together. To close off my sleeve, I used the same blue yarn from earlier. You can use whatever color you like. I would just make sure that it's the same type of yarn that you used on the rest of your sleeve. So before I actually connect my sleeve together, I wanted to include this little visual diagram of how this next part is going to go. So I just screen recorded this on Snapchat. Basically, I want to point out how I push the yarn through both sides of the sleeve and then pull it back through. And I repeat this all the way down the sleeve. It's sort of like a weaving process. After I made it to the end of the sleeve, I just tied off both ends. So now here's the actual demonstration of me closing off the sleeve. So I start by pulling my yarn through the corner of one of the sides. Sometimes this part is easier to do by hand, but I usually like using my hook for it just because it helps me grab hold of the yarn easier, but obviously I have some difficulties doing this. In this part, I am going to grab the yarn that I passed through the first side, and I'm going to pull it straight through the other side. The whole time that I'm closing off my sleeve, I'm making sure that I'm passing the yarn through the loops that are directly opposite of each other. So after I have the yarn through the first loop, I'm going to find the next one in line to go through. This is a part where I prefer using my hook over my fingers because it helps me keep everything organized. So I push my hook through the next hole in line, and then I push it through the other side as well. I make sure that they're directly across from each other too. After I push it through the other side, I make sure that I have 4 loops on top of my hook. I went through 2 loops whenever I went through just the plain blue side, and then I went through 2 more loops on the multicolored side. Each side of my sleeve should sort of look like a braid. You can see it a lot better on the multicolored side. And this is sort of like what we talked about in the very beginning with the chain. So I should be able to find 2 loops on each side to go through, which makes 4 whenever I finally have my hook all the way through. Finding the 4 loops to go through sometimes takes me a little time, but I really like to make a point to do this because whenever I finish closing up my sleeve, it's a lot more secure. Now I've pulled a lot of yarn to the other side, and I'm going to loop this yarn behind my hook and pull it through those 4 loops. This part is sometimes tricky because the yarn easily comes off while you're trying to pull it through, but it takes me a couple times to get it, and I eventually get it through. Now I pull all of the yarn through, and I do the same thing to the very next loop. So here I'm looking for the next loop on each of the sides, and I push my hook through it first so that I can grab the yarn and pull it through. Here I'm showing you again how there are 4 loops on my hook at this time, and this just makes it more secure whenever I finally finish. So I pull the yarn all the way through, and I do the same thing to the next loop. I just push my hook through both sides, check and make sure that there's 4 loops on top of it, and then I grab the yarn and pull it all the way through. I keep doing this all the way down until I reach the end of the sleeve. When I finally get to the end, I cut off both sides of the yarn and tie it off really well. I do about 2 or 3 knots just to make sure it won't come apart. And now my sleeve is done. It has a few loose strings, but now it's time for the fun part.